Okay, welcome, world politics students. We're going to continue talking about nuclear proliferation. And again, this ties into the material covered in chapter 6 in your book. Last time we talked about the probability that this non-proliferation regime is going to be stretched to its breaking point over the coming years. Let's hope not, but trends seem to be pointing in that direction. That said, it's held up better than we anticipated. For example, in 1963, JFK, John F. Kennedy, was fairly upset he couldn't negotiate a full comprehensive test ban treaty, and he lamented this. He said he was haunted by it for a while, and he claimed that there would be 15 or perhaps 20 nuclear armed states by the middle of the 1970s. That hasn't happened. The regime is held better than we thought. Even though it's not perfect, it has a lot of flaws. The know-how's out there. We see the materials seeping out there. But it's held up for the most part better than we could have hoped. There are only 9 nuclear states in the world today, nuclear armed states with weaponry. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. Israel does not publicly admit that they have nuclear weapons, so they are what is called a de facto nuclear state. Everyone knows they're a nuclear power. One of their prime ministers actually admitted it once. Journalists and other observers have seen during tense times weaponry being wheeled out of silos, especially there are photographs, claimed photographs, during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War of such weaponry being wheeled out of silos. So everyone's very confident that Israel has nuclear weaponry and ballistic missiles. South Africa actually had at least one, perhaps 2, fairly crude nuclear weapons during the apartheid regime of all-white rule in South Africa. But when when apartheid collapsed, the country transitioned to majority rule. They renounced their nuclear weapons. They allowed inspectors in. They dismantled completely their program. So there are 9 nuclear weapon states in the world today. This regime hasn't changed, so why do people argue it's going to be stretched to its limits in the coming years? I mean, it's the same. It's the partial test ban treaty and the non-proliferation treaty. Why is it going to be pushed to its limits? The argument is that there are a lot of variables beyond treaties, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, this regulatory watchdog for the NPT treaty, there are a lot of things beyond treaties that prevent states from going nuclear because, again, old technology, material can be gotten if a country is determined. And those things are really power politics. There's been pressure, there have been threats against countries that have the potential or threaten to become nuclear actors. We see this with Iraq in the past, actual invasion, pressure against North Korea, Libya, Iran, and the agreement that was reached and now was reached and has changed. And the key actor delivering these threats or security guarantees so countries do not have to develop nuclear weapons for much of the past 50 years has been the United States. The United States has been the main policeman on the nuclear proliferation beat for a very long time. providing security guarantees to a whole host of very technologically sophisticated countries that could get nuclear weapons if they wanted to. And also, again, pressuring countries that aren't tightly allied with the United States who are considering getting nuclear weapons, cajoling them and preventing them from getting nuclear arsenals. The reason why people think this regime is under a greater threat is the US position in the world's changed. We are not in a unipolar moment of sole United States dominance anymore. We've talked about this in the past. Your book discusses this. You can read about it in various news headlines. And for our allies, a lot of American security guarantees look different than they did a decade ago or 2 decades ago for many reasons. One is changes in domestic politics in the US. The Trump administration really took a hard line on allies, was critical, heavily critical of many of our longstanding allies because of claims that our allies were not providing enough to mutual security and that, in a sense, we were carrying their water. There's some truth to that. There's some truth to the fact that it's very beneficial for the United States to have allies and have partners and have countries that aren't nuclear armed under our nuclear umbrella. But regardless of these strategic considerations, the Trump administration's stance towards allies has led some to question whether the United States would really be there if threats emerged, if the United States would defend them in the midst of a nuclear confrontation. The Biden administration has returned to a more orthodox foreign policy for the United States, or for allies who were worried about US guarantees. Who's to say that another administration won't come along in the future that is, again, critical and, again, seemingly unwilling or less willing or hesitant to provide those kind of security guarantees? Who knows? We don't know if there'll be future United States administrations that are of a similar ilk. More than that, countries that are threats to our allies now have the ability to launch ICBMs, nuclear armed ICBMs, that can reach the US mainland. Here, I'm talking about North Korea. This is a fairly new phenomenon. 2017, North Korea tested ICBMs that clearly have the range to hit the US mainland. So allies, again, the world's changing. It's becoming more multipolar. Our longstanding allies, especially those near North Korea, those in Asia, might rightly question in coming years or in a decade whether the United States will really defend them against North Korea when North Korea can, it seems, wipe a US city off the map. Would the US really defend an Asian ally against North Korea if the consequences, there's no more San Francisco or there's no more Houston or Dallas? That's an open question. Our guarantees still remain, but the strategic landscape has changed dramatically with North Korean ballistic missile development. As new countries develop nuclear weaponry, and as US predominance fades, there are questions about whether countries that are rivals with those new nuclear states will begin to develop their own nuclear weaponry. Again, North Korea. North Korea in 2017 sent missiles over Japan, over the archipelago, into the Atlantic Ocean. A clear threat, clear saber rattling. Of course, North Korea claimed that it was completely peaceful. They always have this strange verbiage coming out from their political machine. They claim that they were sending uh, satellites into orbit to sing praise to the great leader, and so that alien civilizations would understand how great North Korea is and it's a paradise on earth. They always have this strange propaganda machine with just outrageous claims. Putting that aside, Japan rightly fears for its security because this island nation could be eliminated from the earth with nuclear strikes. And of course, they're the only country in history to have experienced nuclear weapons and the horrors of nuclear weapons. They are the only non-nuclear state that have major ready facilities for enriching uranium, reprocessing plutonium. The argument is they're just a screwdriver's turn away from nuclear weapons because they have to be, because of the threat of North Korea. They haven't turned that screwdriver. They haven't publicly announced becoming a nuclear power. And there are historic reasons because of their constitution, which was written by the US after 1945, and strategic international reasons as well. They haven't done any of these things, but they're at the brink, and there are reasons to question US security guarantees. South Korea, another country, very economically advanced, clearly has the capability to build nuclear weapons in a very short amount of time. They recently purchased nuclear weapons powered submarines for their Navy. And the byproduct, the waste product from these submarines is even more easily transfixed, transmuted, changed into weapons than the reactors we talked about before, heavy water reactors. And they're even developing ballistic missile capabilities from submarines, the only non-nuclear state to do that. Again, because of the threat of North Korea. Iran, as they continue with their nuclear weapons program, and if they cross that threshold, they have a whole host of rivals within the Middle East. Foremost among them, Saudi Arabia, right across the Persian Gulf. Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, has just come out and publicly said Saudi Arabia will go nuclear if Iran goes nuclear. And Saudi Arabia has bought ballistic missile capabilities from China. And there are domino effects. There are all sorts of ways this can spill over to other countries. There's a Sunni Arab rivalry between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. They're supporting different sides, or supported different sides in the Syrian civil war. And there are all sorts of tensions between those two countries that we really don't have time to develop right now. In large part, searching for influence and power within that region between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And the leader of Turkey has in the past claimed that Turkey, as they're a regional power, should become a nuclear power in the future. So all these dominoes could fall. And the world is changing as the United States recedes from unipolar dominance. We don't know how this will play out. The barrier that the non-proliferation regime has put up to proliferation has held up to this point, but it's looking weaker than it has perhaps at almost any time in the past. Here's a cartoon illustrating this from the British news weekly, The Economist magazine. And it shows the threat of nuclear war, a very, very scary looking beast. And and I guess this is the world looking at this beast saying, is it me, or do the chains holding this beast back sound looser of late? And the chains are nuclear treaties, non-proliferation, detente between those two nuclear powers, India and Pakistan, which there have been a great number of tensions between these two countries over the years and recently. The threat of nuclear war seems a little bit more scary now, and the threat of nuclear proliferation seems a little bit more worrying now as we move into this multipolar era. There are other threats which are also scary. And again, they all stem back from the fact that this is old technology. Materials seeping out, it's becoming available. We're trying to keep the lid on the nuclear genie because of the fear of life on the planet, but there are so many international pressures right now. So what are some of the other pressures? Non-state actors are another pressure that we wouldn't have thought of 15 years ago or more. There is clear evidence, as your book points out, that the Al-Qaeda, we found this out after the war in Afghanistan, that Al-Qaeda was trying to acquire a nuclear weapon. And they had come some way towards that. And there was clear evidence that they were willing to use nuclear weapons based on the writings we recovered in various raids and the documents we recovered in various raids. This cartoon shows scientists under pressure at gunpoint from Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. There's no real evidence that the Taliban in Afghanistan has come as close or is as willing as Al-Qaeda is. But the worry is many Pakistani nuclear facilities are near Afghanistan in what are called Pakistani tribal areas. And the Taliban have links within these tribal areas. So there's worry that the Taliban may eventually seek to become nuclear as well. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of non-state actors. There's evidence that came out about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, that the Italian mob, the mafia, not only did they traffic in nuclear waste, now we talked about this before, the byproduct of certain types of peaceful energy reactors, the waste is actually weapons grade material. So this would be sought after and command a high price, obviously, on the black market. It's not a surprise. The Italian mafia was involved in this. Various trials, crackdowns on political corruption in Italy, this was brought to light that the Italian mob was, without a doubt, trafficking nuclear waste for these purposes, brought a high dollar. But more than that, they were attempting to build their own bomb. Why? I mean, this was broken up. The ring was broken up, the ring of trafficking ring in terms of this nuclear waste. And the plans were found, and apparently this was all broken up. But why would the Italian mob need to have a nuclear bomb? It's bad enough Al-Qaeda. It's bad enough proliferation may increase. And again, these weapons can end life as we know it. Why in the world would the Italian mob need? I leave that as an open question, a rhetorical question. Don't ask me. They wanted to threaten their rivals. They wanted to threaten the Italian police if the Italian police tried to crack down on them? I don't know about that. Another example of just how, and this is a state actor, but it shows weaponry getting involved, nuclear products, weaponry getting into the hands of non-state actors. Remember way back at the beginning of class, we talked about Albania. Backward country, totally closed off from the rest of the world, totally sealed off. No interaction except for some Chinese diplomats that came in to the capital city. That's it. When the country descended into chaos, into civil war, the Albanian government at the time publicly sent out notices to those who raided Albanian military munitions depots to return the nuclear materials to the depots. So Albania, backwater state, didn't have running water and electricity in large parts of the country, didn't really have electricity outside of the capital city. And yet, this country had nuclear weapons, and this country lost these nuclear weapons. So this shows how dangerous this is and how the cat can easily get out of the bag. And we clearly haven't tracked all the potential weaponry out there. Albania. The world had a different chance. The world had a chance to put all these materials under wraps, under international control. And this was called the Baruch Plan. This was a lost opportunity, but it may have been naive to think it ever could have been a reality. As long as nations in this competitive world need whatever means possible for security, perhaps this plan never could have come to fruition. So what was the Baruch Plan? The Baruch Plan was a plan put forward by the United States after the Second World War. The United States, immediately after the Second World War, was the only nuclear weapons power in the world. The only country in the world with nuclear weapons. The only country. Actually, Nazi Germany, before its defeat, there's pretty strong evidence. Well, we know they had a nuclear weapons program. We know they're working on fission, and it seems they tested at least one nuclear weapon before they ran out of time and the regime was defeated. But at the end of the Second World War, the dawn of the nuclear era, when these weapons were being conceived, only one country in the world had nuclear weapons, the United States. We proposed a plan called the Baruch Plan. Mr. Baruch was U.S. representative at the UN Atomic Energy Commission, but it had the full weight of the U.S. administration. And the plan was to put any potentially dangerous nuclear devices under UN stewardship. And any peaceful use of nuclear material would be licensed by the UN and monitored by the Security Council. And peaceful uses are low yield, small scale devices. So very, very small devices of limited power are used for things like blowing sites into mountains so that tunnels can be created for roadways or trains or other transportation. So there are peaceful, small-scale uses. With this plan, the U.S. basically agreed to give up an amazingly powerful new weapon and a huge strategic advantage. And the argument from some is that we did this because we knew of the devastating potential. And after the end of the Second World War, when U.S. troops went into Japan, we saw firsthand some of the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. So we were so fearful that we wanted to give up control of the weapons to prevent their development. The Soviet Union did not accept the Baruch Plan. Joseph Stalin, leader at the time, didn't believe the United States would dismantle all of our nuclear weapons programs. And he also feared, well, he claimed that a weapon under UN control was basically a weapon under US control or Western control. Because the vast majority of the UN General Assembly at that time sided with the West. 4 out of 5 of the country's permanent members of the Security Council sided with the West at that time. At that time, nationalist Taiwan controlled the Security Council seat and not Beijing, communist China. He argued that because the US was the only country that had the ability to build the bomb, and the UN was so heavily Western leaning, that it basically would have been a Western bomb indefinitely. But some argue that the US, although we may have been earnest, and it seems we were, again, there was discussion within the US government and disagreement, but the administration was earnest in this attempt. Some argue that we couldn't have maintained this position even if the Soviet Union agreed. And that was because we were at such a numerical disadvantage militarily to the Soviet Red Army in Europe. As the Cold War started to develop, we would have had to have turned to nuclear weapons. Otherwise, the Red Army could have theoretically swept across Europe as the US brought the majority of our troops home. And regardless, even during the Second World War, the Red Army was the blunt edge of the Allied force against Nazi Germany. At no point during the war was more than 1/3 of Nazi forces, German forces, arrayed against the US, Britain, and France, all the Western powers on the Western Front. 2/3 after the Soviet Union entered the war, 2/3 of the Nazi war machine was arrayed against the Red Army and the Soviet Union. It's estimated that at least 3/4 and perhaps 80% of German casualties in that war were on the Eastern Front. So the Red Army was incredibly powerful at this time. And these fears lasted through the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Just the numerical advantage the Red Army had throughout the Cold War was significant. Stalin, I mean, people dispute whether this quote, he really said this, but something attributed to him over time was that quantity has a quality all its own. The Soviet Red Army just helped to overwhelm Nazi Germany and the Wehrmacht, the German army. And the Red Army was ferocious, in part because Stalin ordered that they fight to their last man. And they killed deserters or anyone that didn't show courage. It's estimated there was something called barrier troops, troops behind the lines. And if anyone was suspected of attempting to desert or not fulfilling their duties with earnest, they were assassinated, they were killed. And it's estimated that 150,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives to their own barrier troops or their own officers. At the beginning of the war, they were going into battle without rifles and without adequate preparation. As the Soviet war machine built up. Tangent, just a quick tangent. It's also interesting to note that the Red Army made significant use of female combat troops. You have to go back to the time, and again, Soviet Union, communist ideology, everyone was supposed to be equal. They were supposed to be new. socialist men and women who were built from the same mold and all part of a common um, Soviet identity where gender was not as critical, not important in the Soviet person. Um, as many as 1 million female fighters fought on the Red Front, on the front lines, the Eastern Front, for the Red Army. And many women volunteered for some of the most dangerous combat missions to prove their mettle. Some of the most feared soldiers, yeah, within the Red Army were what were called, I mean, one example is what were called the Night Witches. And these were female pilots who flew old biplanes. Now remember biplanes from the First World War, those planes with 2 sets of wings, and they would dive bomb German forces at night. And they were incredibly fearsome, incredibly brave. And German troops feared these night missions. The Night Witches, female pilots for the Red Army. But anyway, so some argue that even though the US administration may have been in earnest, eventually we would have had to turn to nuclear weapons again because of the numerical superiority of the Red Army as the Cold War intensified in Europe. And so the two sides were roughly at an impasse. Stalin refused to reduce the numerical strength of the Red Army because the United States had the bomb, and the United States, it is argued, eventually would not have given up the bomb because of the numerical strength of the Red Army. And it was at this time that Einstein was quoted as saying that everything has changed with the advent of nuclear weapons, except our thinking. And this is also when Einstein said that physics is easier than politics. Politics is a much more difficult subject than physics. Everything had changed by our thinking with the advent of these horrible weapons. And of course, Einstein's other famous quote was that he didn't know what the Third World War would be fought with, but given the advent of nuclear weapons and whatever would be more horrific that would come after them, he knew what the Fourth World War would be fought with, and that would be sticks and stones. And this is a cartoon saying, a play on Einstein's claim, the power of nuclear weapons and their destructive capability, and evolution. So in terms of evolution, humans would again be back to square one. That's again a little bit too far-fetched. We'd still be humans, but we'd be back. Civilization would be wiped out. This cartoon is of nuclear weapons as the Grim Reaper, born 3/4 of a century ago. That'd be over 3/4 of a century ago. And the Grim Reaper with its claws, its clutches on Earth, and a specter kind of hovering over at all times Earth. So where does that leave us? This lost chance, the Baruch plan, never came to fruition. The non-proliferation regime is a thin reed, it's a thin membrane that's keeping proliferation in check. But as the world changes, as it becomes more multipolar, as rivalries in different regions intensify, fear is that proliferation will spread. And just one mad person, one madman, using using nuclear weapons could, again, set off a chain reaction that would be beyond comprehension in terms of devastation to mankind and to life, all life on our planet. There is a hopeful note. The hopeful note is that most states, at least in the coming years, they don't want the trouble of nuclear weapons. They don't want to mess with it. So think about it. Even though John Phillips created a Nagasaki class bomb in his dorm room, or a prototype, to have warheads on missiles is a sophisticated enterprise. And that requires a full-scale program within your country or your non-state actor. Scary enough. And this is expensive, and you really can't use them. Well, you hope not to use them, because if you use them, you might be annihilated yourself in retaliation. So these are very expensive weapons. The programs are very difficult, if not impossible to use. You face international censure. You face potential sanctions. You face all sorts of shaming on the international stage. So for many states, it's just not even worth it. And hopefully this reality of it's just impractical. They're not worth their cost. They're not worth the effort. And the suffering your country would, economic and other suffering your country would face, that many countries won't deal with it. On the other hand, again, as rivals get them, as Iran, North Korea, and then their rivals start to get them, the potential is there for more and more countries to get them. Let's hope that the proliferation regime holds throughout our lifetimes and our children's lifetimes. And let's hope that we never see these weapons used again. But again, know-how's out there, materials available, a lot of geopolitics involved in preventing their spread. 2 key treaties, they're being pushed to their limits